And I left the discussion of Cyrus to this week, though I really could have covered it last week because I was thinking we might enter into discussion about Darius as well, but we'll just leave Darius until we get to Darius. And the real point, though there still is definitely conflict that is many people or critics of the Bible would have with this mention of Cyrus. In particular, the text says, and Daniel continued even into the first year of King Cyrus. That's how it reads in King James Bible. I think most others are fairly similar to that. And elsewhere in chapter 10, and I believe it talks about, in the third year of Cyrus. So therefore they're saying in chapter 1, Daniel said he only continued till the first year, but then in verse 1 of chapter 10, he says he's in the third year. Chapter 1 here does not necessarily tell us that, this is when he died, that he's trying to say that. It's most likely what the point they're making here at the conclusion of this chapter and probably into the first 3.5 verses in the next chapter, as we have a language change in the middle of the book, which is pretty odd within the Bible. It only occurs elsewhere in Ezra, which is also pretty close to the same time period as this, maybe 50, 100 years after this. But we're going to be switching from Hebrew to Aramaic. Well, actually, we're going to be in English the whole time, but the text that is translated from switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. The point I think Daniel is getting across here is that he stayed through the entire captivity, and it ended. And it ended with Cyrus. It's interesting that Daniel continues on into the reigns of Cyrus and Darius and things of that sort and how those are put together, but that he doesn't go back. That's something to think about, that, other people were no doubt probably striving to get back. Now, perhaps many, of course, assimilated into the culture that they were. No doubt, I would think Nebuchadnezzar's plan probably worked pretty good for a lot of people, where he would conquer them and basically re-educate them, is my terminology that I like to use, that I think other cultures have done. So they would have stayed, but Daniel stays true to God and what God would desire, yet he stays here. And but he still has influence, of course. I'm not trying to judge Daniel and say, Daniel, I do not know how you could be so foolish not to return to Jerusalem. That's not what we're saying. It's just kind of interesting. But I think the point he's making here at the end of chapter 1 is that he stayed through the entire reign, the entire captivity until Babylon falls. And that occurs later on here in chapter 5, 6, I think. And but we'll get into Darius as well and how that individual, did Daniel really live that long, or did, of course, most critics of the Bible would just say, look, whoever wrote it just messed up and got confused. Of course, surprisingly, I will not opt for that interpretation, but we'll get to that when we get to that. But yeah, we do have a language change here in the middle of verse 4 of chapter 2 as we move into that. So let's read a couple of verses here. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him. Then the king commanded to call the magicians and astrologers and sorcerers and the Chaldeans to show the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream. My spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Okay, we'll stop there at verse 4 for a moment. And this is where we have a language change from right in the middle of verse 4. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac is in Hebrew. And then, O king, live forever is in Syriac or Aramaic. And that continues through the end of chapter 7. I think, and there are a couple of prominent interpretations. Why did this occur? It's not by accident. And this also points to, Daniel is one of the books that's really argued and said, this was probably written around the year 150. BC and not at all around, 500, 600 when Daniel lived. But this, of course, as many other things, argue for an earlier date of 5 to 600 when it actually says it was. One of those, if you're a Christian, is the fact that Jesus quoted from it and acted like there was a guy named Daniel who actually said the exact same things that were in the book named Daniel. So that's a pretty big argument if you're a believer. Another one is that if you were forging a book in that period, it wouldn't make much sense to write half of it in one language and half of it in another, especially if many of the people wouldn't be able to read it that you were trying to write to. So, that doesn't, and much of the, what we might call apocryphal literature written around 150 BC, there was a lot of those books. They're mainly written in Greek because that was coming into full swing there. And this is not. This would be a one-of-a-kind that was forged at that time. We would just call it what it is. It's a forgery if that's what it is. But it's not. But there's a definite emphasis here. Then spake Chaldeans, the king, and Syriac, and they start speaking in that. That this is common within the literature of up to around 600 BC, that they would switch into different languages. I'm certain you do that all the time throughout the day for emphasis. But they would do that. It was common that they would, in the middle section would be in some other thing that they wanted to communicate or to stress that this is really important. And this section is really important. And, all of it is, though. But, okay, so that's one interpretation. It was just done for stressing or importance and things of that sort, trying to prove a point. And that's what I would say is probably going on there. I don't think it was an accident. It certainly wasn't an accident. It was certainly intentional. They pick up right at the quote and how they're trying to say. Another one, which you might like, but I do not find proper or really correct, is the idea that what they're saying here at the beginning or in the middle of verse 4, they're switching to Aramaic, which was a broader language of the culture. It would be like English today. It would have been used more in business and politics and things like that. So it would have been how kingdoms communicated with each other. And this is for the Gentiles at large. And after we get to the end of chapter 7, which does contain some interesting prophecies, then we switch back to Aramaic, and that's for the Jews, or switch back to Hebrew. That's for the Jews in chapter 8 through 12, and because they're, of course, the only ones that are going to have to go through the tribulation. I hope that's right. I just don't think it is. I hope that's correct, but I don't think it is. That seems to, and especially because we'll have Antichrist and Messiah in both of these sections. I think those apply to all people. Certainly, I think the New Testament makes a clear argument and point that Messiah is for everybody. It's not like there's two different ways. That you can do this and I can do that. And, it's all, sort of like our popular models today. You can do what you want and I'll do what I want and we'll all end up at the same place. There's not two different models here that God has laid out. I find that, and if that's true, what about in Ezra? Is the same thing occurring there? Well, nobody really says that. They just think, I don't know, Ezra just did that because he could. No doubt, again, also stressing important things that have bypassed us because we really don't know about these things. All right, these aren't huge points, but it does argue for an earlier writing. No surprise to us. There are other things that argue against that, but would create difficulty, but we'll deal with those when we come to them. The idea would be that they really wanted the world at large to know about these sections, but that whole argument says chapters 2 through 7 are written in Aramaic, so the whole Gentile world can see that this is important. That argument says that's the only part that's important out of the whole Bible. That's it. That's all you need right there. It doesn't hold a lot of weight to me. But I think that people have They have a certain interpretation of end times, and they tried to fit that on there. But anyway, we can disagree on that, and still end up at the same place. So that's okay. All right, but that's one of the very interesting things about this section. And Ezra chapters 4 through 6 and part of chapter 7 are written in that. Daniel, one verse in Jeremiah. It's a single sentence in the middle of the verse which denounces idolatry. So using that same argument in Jeremiah 10:11 in the middle of the verse, that's for all the Gentiles to really understand. But the rest of Jeremiah, okay. Genesis 31 has one also. But all right, yeah.
It's the Pennsylvania Dutch. They talk in their own families, and when you get them out in the community, they talk English.
Yeah.
So that might help. There might be sort of an endearing to certain language.
Yeah, that's certainly true. It just,
and I wonder if there would be certain words that wouldn't be able to be expressed in another language if maybe he's trying to do that.
Well, that's definitely true because in Genesis 31:47, there's an Aramaic place mentioned there. There are definitely Aramaic words in the New Testament that, it's not even translated really. I mean, I can't think of any off the top of my head, but we can.
When Jesus was on the cross.
Right, yeah.
And why did they do that? Why did the writer not translate that into English?
Well, sometimes
he does explain it, but he gives you the...
I don't know. But, that's...
Eloi,
yeah, right.
No, I think a lot of it is for emphasis. Because when you're comfortable with another language, sometimes there are concepts that are a lot more easily explained.
Oh, yeah.
Or there's a lot more feeling that goes with a certain phrase or something in one language than another.
It's sort of like we've talked about hell and Hades. Hades, it's difficult to really, there is a lot of baggage with all that, and so lots of new Bibles are not translating Hades. They're just leaving it as Hades. Now, what does Hades mean? Well, it takes us half an hour to figure this, just to get a rough idea of it. So, but yeah, there are definitely emphasis there. Some things are more, some things are just hard to translate, and it's easier just to leave it as it is. And, something I noticed about that was like baptized, there's all sorts of, we can see the history that there's death and murder and all sorts of stuff that goes along with that. Then you look at the Hebrew word or the Greek word baptizo, and what's the English baptized? What did they tell us there? Well, that's baptized, but baptized means different. I mean, people died over that, Well, they died over everything, in a way. Maranatha, Corinthians. Why didn't he just, if there was a guy that could use the languages as Paul, he could. I think that is another one that would have had a lot of emphasis for the people that it was written to right then, more so than it does for us, kind of like this, when well, that's weird, especially for me, that, for those people that you were talking about, the Pennsylvania Dutch, that would, for endearment, there are certainly concepts in the one they could probably communicate a lot better, or, translators talk about the heart language and, what really communicates to your heart versus reading the book. It's like, I see what it says, but it doesn't really mean anything to me. So, yeah. Good points. There you go. Where are we at? Okay, switch of languages. We covered that Hebrew, Aramaic, and there's lots of course, arguments about the language that Jesus would have spoke. Used to, people would say it was primarily Greek, but that's definitely fading. Hebrew was always there, It wouldn't have been necessarily the main one, but it was probably more like Aramaic, which would have been the common one that he would have used. But he definitely, and not just because he's Jesus, he could have obviously taught anything he wants. But the people of that day that would have been in his circle would have done that. Aramaic, what would have been the most common. But they're fine. And lots of this, it isn't that we have, published statistics that they took a census in, 30 AD and said, this is the percent of the people in Palestine that were speaking Hebrew, this percent were speaking Aramaic, and this percent were speaking Greek. We don't have that. Lots of this is just arguments from what we find and what we dig up. It's kind of hard. I was looking for something a few minutes ago and I couldn't find it. Does that mean that it never existed? No, it doesn't mean that. But that's generally what people do when they're digging up stuff thousands of years ago. If they don't find it, that means it wasn't really there. So that's, kind of flawed. They did that recently with the camels and the horses that we talked about. They didn't find the stuff, so therefore it wasn't there. Obviously, it's very bad to base any of your faith on anything like that. Because, there's a possibility you could dig something up that might change that and, go with God's written word here and what it is. All right, Nebuchadnezzar, he has this dream. And dreams, all sorts of things there. Famous people for dreams. Joseph comes to my mind. Jacob is involved there. Pharaoh. There are others that have dreams and visions, but those are the prominent ones. But here's Nebuchadnezzar. This may have been a way that God communicates to the Hebrew people who are there who's really in charge. And it may be a way, not just to Hebrew people, he's communicating that to everybody. Even the Babylonian people who are there have eyes open, sort of like the Egyptian people, the Pharaoh's servants that had their eyes open a little bit and could see, this God's bigger than whatever these things are that we're serving. Who really controls that? And, God clearly does. Paul talks a little bit about that in Acts 17 in Athens there. Lots of prophecies are going to be connected here. And notice that, Nebuchadnezzar was not a poor man by their standards. He would have been a rich man, but yet he's still troubled. He can't sleep, so riches don't really do it for you. He's got a lot of power. He's got the power for the day in that world that they have, but yet he doesn't have peace of mind. He doesn't have peace of mind, and he dreams a dream, and he can't sleep. Nebuchadnezzar seems to know that his dream didn't come from eating the wrong food. It wasn't because he ate a bratwurst right before he went to bed or something like that. That's not what happened. He knew something's going on here. It's deep in his mind. He's in a highly agitated state. And, he calls all these people, these astrologers and all these people, Chaldeans. It's a term just for Babylonian person in general, but it's also a term for the temple priests that they would have had. Magicians, sorcerers, they would have used, it says herbs, charms, potions, lotion stars, everything you can imagine, evil forces to interpret these things. And of course these practices are condemned in the Old Testament in various places. So it's interesting that Daniel would have been working right in that. Again, how was he able to do that so well? But he did. Nebuchadnezzar's no dummy. He likely attributed his dream to his god called Marduk, or sometimes Bel, but he doesn't really trust his advisors. And so he's going to test them. It is what I've decided. If you do not tell me what my dream was and interpret it, I'll cut you in pieces. That doesn't sound very nice. Maybe he wasn't serious. All right, let's pick up at verse 5. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. But if you show the dream and the interpretation thereof, you shall receive of me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore show me the dream and the interpretation thereof. They answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it." The king answered and said, "I know of certainty that you would gain the time, because you see the thing is gone from me. But if you will not make known unto me the dream, there is but one decree for you, for ye have prepared lying and corrupt words to speak before me, till the time be changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that ye can show me the interpretation thereof." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matters. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things at any magician or astrologer or Chaldean. And it is a rare thing that the king requires, and there is none other that can show it before the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh." And the first part of verse 12 there, "For this cause the king was very angry and furious." We probably read this before. It's probably not shocking to read what we just did. But they're actually talking to Nebuchadnezzar in words that I wouldn't advise. I'm not an astrologer or any of those guys. Notice what he has just said. He said, "If you don't do it, I'm going to cut you in pieces, and your house is gone." It's trashy, dunghill. I think we all know what that means. It's bad. He's not making an improvement. He's not going to renovate the place. He's going to kill you, cut you in pieces. Now, unless we might think, well, maybe he's just overreacting a bit. And he is overreacting, not just a bit, but, this is what he said he's going to do. His consequences, though, are fearful. And the king's threat to cut in pieces is to be taken literally, because that's exactly what he did other times. He literally cut you in pieces. 2 Kings 25, verses 6 and 7. This is Zedekiah. And he was taken to the king of Babylon at Riblah, where sentence was pronounced on him. What they did to Zedekiah, they killed his sons, made him watch. They killed his sons, and then they put out his eyes. And then they put him in chains and carried him off. And, I think I'd rather be cut in pieces than have all that done. They killed his sons, and then they put out his eyes, bound him with bronze shackles, and took him to Babylon. This is what they knew, that he wasn't joking. He was a ruthless guy. He didn't mind to do this, and to kill them, he'd just put in some more people that he wanted. He'd done that before. He just added Daniel and these guys. He could add some more. It's no problem really for him. And notice this is right at the point that Daniel and them have just come in. It's actually, verse 1 is a problem for some people in the second year of the reign, but we're told that Daniel and them would have been in there for about 3 years. So how is that? One of the answers to that is that there is sometimes called a year of ascension, which would really be year 1, but isn't counted as year 1. It's more like year 0. But he would have been in training in that, so that's possible. And there's always overlap between year 1, year 2, year 3, and when they counted the years versus when Daniel would have. And also, Daniel is carried away immediately. Nebuchadnezzar goes back to take the throne in a hurry. But yet he wouldn't have been installed yet even before Daniel got there. So Daniel could have started his training before he was even installed. Okay, so that's one thing there. But he could have easily put more people in. And this is what Daniel comes into right at the beginning, right at the very first. Guess what? We're all going to die. Oh, this is wonderful. I'm so glad I was promoted to this position. And notice the caliber of the advisors here are the best that there are. This is it. Their worldly wisdom, though, is insufficient. Their king suspected that they've been lying to him, and he was right, no doubt. And we see that within Israel's kings. They would, just what do you want the prophet to say? Then the prophet says it. Sort of like, we see in our own day, no doubt, politically in different aspects and places. What do you want me to tell you? That's what I'll tell you, and that's what's true. Even though it's not what's true. In fact, the opposite probably is, but, just what do you want me to tell you? But they tell him he's unreasonable. It's ridiculous to think such a thing, and it goes beyond man's ability. And, their evaluation is correct, but they were frauds. No one can reveal it except the gods, and they do not live among men. So what they've done here is they've set the stage perfectly, really. If you actually serve a god that isn't, dead, Bel, Marduk, whichever one you want to dream up that they could have had. No one can reveal it except the gods. They do not live among men. And so they've set Daniel up. They set up Daniel's God, and they gave correct answer and help here. And it's actually going to play perfectly together because that's true. Man cannot figure it out. They do not know, but Daniel's God does. And as I read that, I'm somewhat amazed that they would have said that, that there's nobody that can do this, that you are, I don't know what you're thinking, and it's a rare thing that you've done this, that there is no one that asks such things as this. How ridiculous can you be, Nebuchadnezzar? Nobody asks things like this. Now, thinking about, that's really quite disrespectful to say that. If I go to a job and my supervisor tells me to do, go climb a 100-foot tree and cut that limb down, which I would probably say the same thing these guys said, because I don't like being up off the ground very much. But, to say, you're crazy, you're asking me the things to do that no one else does. I mean, that's actually quite disrespectful to the supervisor, to the king here. I'm not saying, that how I would have answered, but they're not off to a good start. And in verse 12, for this cause the king was very angry and furious and commanded to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So he's sort of setting them up there, but I think they sort of made their bed, so now they got to sleep in it. Because they, if you really wanted more time, it probably wasn't the best way to go about and say, well, you're asking things that are impossible, and nobody asks things this hard. What are you trying to do to us here? So they set him off, knowing who he was and how he acted and what he had done. And note, you don't get to be the ruler of this kingdom by being a nice guy. I mean, we just don't find a whole lot of people like that are rulers of this most powerful kingdom on earth that are just swell people. They're usually destructive, corrupt in some measure, and ready to destroy anything in their path. And that's just the way it is. So knowing who he is, but nonetheless, they said it. The decree went forth that the wise men should be slain. They sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. So it sort of lends here that Daniel, is just sitting there doing his job, whatever it might happen to be, and that they're going to find them. The king's disappointed. His dream's not interpreted. He's not happy. He's not pleased. He's suspicious. His faith in his God, whatever that God might have been, is shaken. And he reacts to these people that would criticize him. There's no really any court or anything that they have to go to. If that's what he wants, that's what happens. Hasty execution here of the subjects, and he could do without the Chaldeans, but he couldn't do without Daniel. It's an interesting note. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were not right there. It doesn't appear among the advisors that they went to get them, and perhaps because of all the paganism that they would have perhaps been using to interpret these things, they said, no, I'm not going. We're not told that, but it's certainly a possibility. Separating themselves from the pagan religious leaders there of Babylon. One thought is that in a cooler state of mind, Nebuchadnezzar would have understood that the wisest people, those young ones there, were not here, but nonetheless. All right, verses 14 through 16. And Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was going forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree so hasty from the king? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired the king that he would give him time. He would show the king the interpretation. So he's going in and, he's actually doing something very bold also. I would assume that his tone and his attitude was a bit different from those in verses 10 and 11. And he's probably thinking, I would think anyway, in the back of my mind, thanks a lot. You guys running your mouth, getting this guy all riled up, and now I have to go in and try and ask for more time after you've already done this. And he said he's ready to kill us all. But he does. He goes forward, and Daniel's able to act with wisdom, with tact, and to get this accomplished here for this time period. And perhaps the king was able to recognize that, he wasn't there. And these guys were really brilliant. It says 10 times better than those that they were schooled with and other people that were there with them. And so he's obviously held in high esteem by Nebuchadnezzar to some degree here. And he asked for time to do it, and perhaps his calmness rubbed off on Nebuchadnezzar there. But he admits he doesn't presently have the answer. And notice previously, Nebuchadnezzar had said, you're just stalling for more time. And interesting, Daniel is basically saying, yeah, I'm stalling for more time. And because I don't have the answer here. And, but he was going to contact God. And, that's a lesson. Turn to God, commit to the Lord, and see what he will do. And our plans will work out as God wants them to. We would say, as Proverbs 16:3, commit your plans to the Lord, and your plans will succeed according to God's plan. Not necessarily what, keeping in mind there a biblical definition of succeed. The Lord works out everything for his own ends, even the wicked for a day of disaster. Wow. But not pleasant.
I think that the king would have had a bit of a conception that Daniel served the true and living God. And you especially see that when Belshazzar, the queen had to tell him, well, he knew. Mm-hmm. He knew Daniel was God's man.
He would have had to.
And I think that Nebuchadnezzar here would have had, people knew that the Jewish people's God was.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think people know today.
I think that's true. And that's interesting because you bring up, I was thinking, they knew that Israel's God was different, yet they also had seen that Israel's been carried off. Mm-hmm. And they've seen also that there's a lot of, there's a lot of paganism, idolatry within Israel that caused that to happen. Now, whether or not they could put all that together, I don't really know. But that's true even today as well, even though we see a lot of people that, may claim to be believers that don't act like believers. But people still know, they've had, but I would also point to the fact within the Western culture, our culture at least, that there's been a big foundation, for, right or wrong, if people acted right or wrong throughout, the centuries. I'm not here to argue about that right now, but, when you look at the Puritans and all those people, the foundations that were laid, there's just the idea that there's God, he's real, and he works. People would have known that, and that's been drilled in for years. We see, of course, it trying to be removed at this time, but yeah, and maybe Nebuchadnezzar is sort of, wants to test that out. I mean, it's interesting, but yeah, they would have known there in chapter 5, but also there's after, that's after he's gone back, this whole weirdness of him turning into basically an animal for a period of time there. So, that definitely would, this is before that. So, but yeah, they would have known. I think maybe there might be some testing here going on because of his God and seeing which one's really powerful. Or, yeah.
I was thinking that someone told me once that Nebuchadnezzar really didn't trust all these Chaldeans and wise men because he had apparently, and this was a big enough subject he was thinking about, about what was going to happen. Was he going to be able to keep this whole big empire together?
Mm-hmm.
So, and these guys, quite often, when he would go and ask them something, they would kind of asking some questions, and they come up with, they get a kind of a consensus of what they're
Right.
looking for. And this way here, when he denies being able to tell them the dream and makes them tell the dream, that's kind of like, really putting it to the test.
Yeah, I would say that's totally in line with what we would see and what we would know from other rulers also. And, struggling to keep the kingdom together. And we know it wasn't too terribly long after this that the kingdom wasn't together. And in fact, it's taken pretty much without a battle at all. They just walk in and take it. And that's all there is to it. But that shows, that also shows, I don't know, that's just odd and different that he would do that if that's what he's doing. Most rulers throughout history would just say, tell me what I want to hear. Whereas he seems to be saying, I'm going to test these guys out and see what's really going on. Is he testing them? Is he testing Daniel and his God and what's going on? I think those things all play together. It's not written out in the text specifically for me that says, thus and thus and thus and thus and thou shall be. But it seems to all play together, I think. But that notes that he's somewhat of a different individual, that he would be willing to, because that's going out on a limb, to say, what's really going on here? And I think we'll see that play out as we go forward into the other chapters, here in the early section at least, with Nebuchadnezzar. An interesting individual. Though we don't want to lose sight of the fact that, he was a cruel individual. He was no doubt conniving. He was ruthless and all of those things, but he's also got some things lying there underneath there that are playing into this, and as Daniel will witness about God to him throughout, as he goes forward here. Yeah.
I was also thinking too, since I have studied this over a little bit, this first few chapters of it, I kind of think it was prophesied by God that he was going to raise up a king to come and take over Israel. And as we'll probably see when we get out further down in here, that God tries to make that point in that measure that you didn't get this all on your own. I allowed you to do this.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of neat in one way that God allowed Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those four, to be in that first wave of people who was captured. And he put those key people in place, God did, so that he could work in the heart of that community.
Yeah, I think that's certainly in view. Yeah. So interesting characters and decisions that he made, at the very least. All right, that's through verse 16. We're going to stop there for this evening, and this is a long chapter. We'll close with a word of prayer. Dear Father, we thank you for this day, for this time together. We thank you for each one that is here. We thank you for your word that we can look at. We pray that your Spirit would help us to understand it, to learn from it, to apply the truths that we get here. We pray that you would be with us throughout the remainder of this week, that you would give us safety, protection, and that you would watch over us. Help us to glorify you through each thing that we do. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. You're dismissed. Thank you.